Translated into myth on earth. And he tried to explain everything like that. And also to combine everything with this, with everything, because to him, this had not been invented separately in Germany or in ancient Greece or in ancient Iran and in ancient Babylonia. No, it was first created in Mesopotamia, and from there it was spread all over the world. And it was not just discovered by the Babylonians, but it was revealed to the Babylonians. There's an original revelation, a divine revelation. Although he would never describe the God who did this, but you can see in everything that he writes that he believes in an original divine revelation. And from this moment on, these stories are part of our mental DNA. And they are spread further and further, and we are still telling them. It's a divine flame and divine inspiration in us, as he saw it. And when you hear that, you can understand in what kind of time we are living. We are in the late 19th century. It's a sort of dark version of romanticism that reigns in literature, in the arts, and these people are the academic version of that. Great questions about origins, about life and death, dark visions about dark origins, and even an obsession, I would say, with these origins. So I jump a little bit, because I'm talking about this Stucken. His books were not taken very seriously, these astral mythen. Interestingly, when he switched to writing novels, according to the same lines, Die Weiße Götter, it worked really well. They were well read and well received. This is already an interesting perspective on what these people were doing. What they were doing was much more literature than science, and I will come back to that. So, this is a description by one of the other pan-Babylonians, who himself gives a description of this. And as you see, he himself says, he admits that everything vom Himmel offenbarte Urweisheit is derived. And also that everything is read, as he says, abgelesen from the stars in the sky. So they themselves admitted this openly. So there is what we call a diffusionist perspective. There's one origin, divine origin, and it spreads from that. But this is only part of what they were doing. The other thing is, because they were doing this, they were breaking through traditional boundaries between disciplines. And in this sense, the pan-Babylonian movement includes a real promise for the humanities, I think. They were really very much against separating, for instance, ancient Greece from the ancient Near East, because they saw it as a cultural continuum. They saw it as one area in which this enormous spreading of stories, of divine stories, was happening. So they really were laughing at the idea that ancient Greece was a unique creation, a monolithic culture, white cities under blue skies, a new kind of humanity. No, it was one step among many in the ascent of human culture. They saw Greek culture as any culture within a large tapestry of cultures. And mind you, these people were incredibly well read. They were trained in school in Greek and Latin. Then they studied Assyriology. Many of them knew also ancient Indian, ancient Iranian. They knew modern Arabic, for instance. All of them knew Hebrew. So they knew all the languages, but they were also interested in anthropology and psychology. And they were well networked. They knew the great minds of their time. They knew, for instance, Nietzsche is sort of related to this group, right? So they are an intellectual group of people, and on top of all of this, they are angry young men. And they studied together, and when they were 30, 35, they started to publish. And you see that there are bands of angry young men. They are not only against, you know, this classical philology, but they're also angry at the earlier generation of professors that are sitting on their chairs and are not asking the questions that they want to ask. They want to be free. They want really to do something much wider. And they are very emotional about it. And they don't hide their emotions. And they write with a force which you cannot imagine of any academic publication nowadays. They're quite incredible. So, they have one person who is slightly older. Most of them, as I said, were born around 1860. They have one person that they see as inspirational, and that is Friedrich Delitzsch. And he belongs to them in the sense that he believes what they say, and that he encourages them to go on, but he doesn't speak out publicly himself. And they beg him to do so. Because if he will do this, it means that somebody with status in the university will speak on their behalf and that their cause will become maybe more accepted. And this is their tragedy. Because he does, and it has fatal consequences. He gives a lecture, Babel und Bibel, in 1902. And it is held in Berlin in presence of the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And a lot of people in Wilhelminian Germany. Everybody who matters is at this lecture. And this book has been reprinted 6 times, and there were, within 2 years' time, 1,560 reviews and pamphlets against it. 1,560 written reactions, published reactions. What does he say? He compares the biblical stories with the Babylonian stories, and he shows that the biblical stories are dependent of the Babylonian stories. And even more, in his second lecture, that the Babylonian stories are better. Why? Because they are universalist. They are internationalist. The gods of the Mesopotamians doesn't select one people, one nation. The stories of the Babylonians are seen by him as universal. They are the original stories. And the biblical stories are a Jewish version of that have become limited to one nation and to the salvation of that one nation. And the God that belongs to them is a God that has selected them, that one nation, and condemns all the other nations. And he says, what kind of God is that? That is not a God that we can accept in our time, because he is not universalist. And how can a God be God without being universal? Of course, you couldn't say this. You couldn't say this. The Kaiser, who was present at the second lecture, was not amused. Actually, secretly, he really liked it, but he could not say it, because he was head of the German Lutheran Church, and he could not say this, because Delitzsch was really nibbling at the foundations of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he condemned him. And you know what he said? He said Assyriologists like Friedrich Delitzsch should have their learned debates in closed rooms, which Assyriologists after that have always done. To this day, they have never any opinion about anything. So, the third lecture was maybe even worse than the previous two, in the sense that there he became to be really anti-Semite. He was really condemning the Jews. And he sort of fell from his great position in society, and this made him write a horrible book, Die große Täuschung, in 2 volumes, which is about the Jewish world conspiracy. It is a purely anti-Semite book. It's quite terrible. And mean. I mean, it is small-minded. It is very small-minded in comparison to what he did earlier, and that is maybe the biggest crime of this book. Anyhow, Delitzsch killed pan-Babylonist. He killed the work of his pupils, because after this it was only associated with this discussion, and never with the great universalist approach that his pupils really wanted in their work, because they, except for one, were not at all anti-Semites, not at all. So that is a very sorry history, of course. Now, what can we learn from this, and why is all of this strangely important for what we are saying? We are talking about a world that was rapidly changing. Pan-Babylonism was killed by Delitzsch. It lingered on but it was really killed when one of its main leaders, Hugo Winkler, died in 1913, and especially by the breakout of the First World War that killed so many intellectual European traditions. The world really changed. The European and the global world really changed by the First World War. I mean, it's hardly imaginable how different the world in 1918 must have looked. And this is not only true for the pan-Babylonian movement, but for related movements as well. Think of Futurism, an Italian-based artistic movement that was founded only in 1909, and that had a utopian vision on the role machines, engines, had on the future of man. They saw a brave new world, a new man that would be dynamic as this wonderful sculpture of Boccioni, which is this embodiment of optimism about this new century that was starting. And this is only a few years before this sculpture, which has the same thoughts, man and machine, man and mechanism, man robot. But whereas the left one is full of optimism, this one is full of dark ideas about this same principle. This is the original version of it. So it is a robot man sitting on a stone drill, being part of it, being very frightening. And the sculptor himself says about this, I made and mounted a machine-like robot, viscid, menacing, and carrying within itself its progeny, protectively ensconced. Here is the armed, sinister figure of today and tomorrow. No humanity, only the terrible Frankenstein's monster we have made ourselves into. So within the leap of a few years, you see this change of thought. Think also, Futurism was a universalist approach. Another universalist approach of those days was that by the universalism of knowledge. There is an ancient tradition going back to Mesopotamia that if you gather all human knowledge, you will have a utopia. Knowledge as a version of paradise and as a way to peace. And this man, Paul Otlet, he was a Belgian, dreamt of that. He founded the international decimal system of codifying library records and also codifying information. He is often seen as a predecessor of the people who invented the World Wide Web. What he did was classify everything. For instance, ships in Sweden in the 15th century would get a code. And the codes were complex and could be combined in several complicated ways. And you could ask his institution for information. You could write him a postcard and they would go into their files and find it for you and give you the answer on anything. And his goal was to gather all information that had been published until 1900 in this system. And they were busily doing this. And the Belgian government was actively supporting this. Why? Because in his days, everybody understood that this was a pacifist project. This was a project for world peace. In those days, this was not a naive thought. This was a very aggressively pacifist and aggressively optimist thought that with the gathering, the universalist approach of knowledge, you would achieve world peace. And he too, his projects too, died almost with the First World War. They were damaged. After the war, he carried on. And then, with the second invasion of the Germans in Belgium in 1940, it was really the end of it. And the whole project disappeared. And his card files that were damaged and they disappeared and whatever. It's only until the 70s that people started understanding how important he really was with his universalist approach. So now back to the pan-Babylonians, who like these movements because they were so idealist, but also so vulnerable. Nowadays, nobody reads the pan-Babylonian literature again because people say it's silly. They combine everything with everything. They're not critical at all. And they're so strangely emotional. Their books are completely forgotten, and those few people who know about it they will never cite from them. So let's go to the most hardcore pan-Babylonian thinker of all of them, Peter Jensen. Because Peter Jensen, he focused only on one myth, one story, as the origin of everything, and that is the Gilgamesh epic. Now I will talk more about him and the Gilgamesh epic next week, but I will just briefly introduce it to you before I come to my conclusion. He is again a real universalist thinker. So when he says that Homer, or the Bible, or German mythology descends from the Gilgamesh epic, it doesn't mean that those later traditions are less, but that it is interesting to compare them. So here he defends himself, this is in 1924, saying, do I really have to explain to you, you eggheads, that when I say, that there is a Gilgamesh echo in Homer, that I don't mean that Homer has no value? Do I really have to say that? He says it literally, muss ich das wirklich? An emphasis original. And he says then, over one of the most beautiful passages in the Iliad, wer den 24. Gesang der Iliad schaffen konnte und das anmutige Nausicaa-Idyll schaffen könnte, der steht erhaben da über jeglichem ihm zutragenden Stoff und bleibt immer ein König und ein Unsterblicher, which is a nice reference, of course, to the immortality of Gilgamesh. And he writes about the Weltgeschichte der Märchen. Now, mind you, I had told you that the pan-Babylonian movement died with the First World War, and this is absolutely true, except for Jensen. Jensen, naively, stupidly, or whatever you want to call it, went on doing this. And his later books, they appeared in a time that everybody had forgotten about pan-Babylonianism, and they were completely ignored by science or laughed at. He was not taken serious at all. But he went on doing this, and why? Strangely, Jensen, in other publications that he did, he worked, for instance, on the Elamite language from Iran. He worked on Indo-European names, on all kinds of strange languages, in which he was very good. He's still cited for those other publications. He was a very serious researcher. But when he wrote about these things, nobody took him serious. Why can somebody who was so good in the eyes of some in one part of his field be so stupid in another part of his field? This is because this was not science for him. This was something he believed in. And this is, of course, the essence of the pan-Babylonian movement. It's not research anymore, but it is a belief. Think again of Stucken, who wrote about the divine origin of all stories. They believed in this. It was an alternative religion. It was a new form of spirituality based on literature, on a universalist approach of literature. And as such, I maintain what they were doing had a great promise in itself. And to derive this from Gilgamesh is very legitimate, not because you can find Gilgamesh in every hero in every story, but because as an image it's so powerful. And it does indeed serve a universalist approach. And this is also what he himself says. When in the second volume of Das Gilgamesh Epos in der Weltliteratur came out and everybody ignored it, he already anticipated in his preface that people would say, well, you cannot compare everything with everything and how silly this is, and you have to stick to one discipline and not mix everything with everything. And he says, ha! I laugh at these people who say this. Ich aber würde mich dabei heiteren Anlitzes der Fantasie freuen, der Göttertochter, die über hohe Berge hinwegschweben und neue Länder und Meere entdecken darf, während die biedere Vernunft grimmig und tatenlos zu Hause bleiben muss. And I think here, this is programmatic and also portraying himself. He says, I don't want to be so narrow-minded. I don't want to stick to my rationality. I will, like these fairies, the daughters of fantasy. I will go over the highest mountains, I will see all the lands, and this is my vision. And maybe you don't think it's scientific, but I don't care. So that is Jensen. And as I said, in the case of Stucken, this is a very literary approach, and it actually works quite well as literature. And a person very well known to all of us, Thomas Mann, knew about this too. He knew the pan-Babylonian movement, and he used it for Joseph und seine Brüder, his famous 4-volume novel about Joseph in Egypt, the biblical story. And the first volume of this is called Die Geschichten Jakobs, and it is completely pan-Babylonian in setup. And how does he do that? He tells the biblical and the Babylonian stories as if they were the biographies of the people he's talking about. And these people, for instance, Abraham and Moses, and also Jacob, the father of Joseph, they are sort of half aware of the fact that they are living stories, and that they are not only individuals, but they are part of a narrative web. And so you have layer upon layer, and as he says, scene after scene, and theater after theater, and behind all of this lurks the original source. The first line of this novel is quite incredible. Tief ist der Brunnen der Vergangenheit. Sollte ihn nicht unergründlich nennen. And this is the perspective of the pan-Babylonians brought to the highest literature and used by Thomas Mann, because he will make this circle of stories, this network that goes back to a divine revelation, come to a completion in one new man, Joseph. He brings all these stories to an end, he unifies them in himself, and his character, his personality in the novel is based on that of President Roosevelt, whom Thomas Mann saw as the great promise of his age. So he really uses this great promise of the stories of these divine origins identified by the pan-Babylonians to structure his novel. That is really quite wonderful. So, Gilgamesh as the origin of everything. Gilgamesh and his friendship, his love for Enkidu. That is something quite remarkable. It is something that has survived in a weird freshness all these millennia, and this mortality of Enkidu and Gilgamesh has strangely become so immortal. The clay from which the walls of the city of Uruk were made proved to be immortal. When it was found by archaeologists in the 19th century, these walls were still standing almost 20 meters high. And that very same clay was used to write the epic on. These clay tablets that survived into our age, to record this story of two individuals and of this loneliness of Gilgamesh. That is what we will talk about next week. About mortality. About what may be the most essential story that the Orient has given us. But today we talked about another story. A story also told about Gilgamesh, the great hero, as a baby, when he was a great promise. But when he was exposed, because his grandfather feared him, and he survived the wilderness, because he was that one child with a promise, in which man has always believed, and for which reason he has always told this story about this one unique child that will save the world. So let's now go, at the end, to a poem that seems to unite all of these things. There's a museum in Holland. It's the oldest museum. I believe from 1780. It is really an Enlightenment museum, and it collects art, but also instruments of science, and also, for instance, fossils. And among these fossils is this specimen, which was obtained when the museum was founded. And as they entered it in their collections, they described it as Homo deluvii testis et theoskopos, which is Latin for man who has witnessed to the deluge, to the flood, and who has seen God. It is not really a man, it is a giant salamander who is squashed to a rock and has been preserved as a fossil. But in the 18th century, they believed that it was an antediluvian man who lived before the flood. And now they have changed the description, and in a way it sounds very sarcastic. They are saying in the 18th century these silly people believed that this was an antediluvian man, but now we know that it is a giant salamander. This is what Max Weber calls the Entzauberung der Welt. The magic is going away from the world. And there is a Dutch poet who was very angry by this change of description, and he has written a beautiful poem about it, and I have given you a German translation. Maybe we should have the lights for this. And I will, like with the first poem I read for you, I will read it in Dutch, and I think you can follow it in German. I have translated it in German because the German is easier to match with the Dutch. It is called Homo deluvii testis by the poet Ruko Lune. Hier vind ik je, gevat in een stenen bed, blind en bloedeloos reliquie. Betraan je diepe wonden. In 2 kraters drijft voor wereldlijke angst. Waar zijn je zachte ogen? Houd je adem in, geen vuur. Wandel door torenhoge koningsvarens. Als dauwzilver stroomt over je smalle schouders. Tast naar knisperende folianten. Streel blauw sluimerende bladen. Wees trouwe kluizenaar in koude boekerij. Wees alleen. Wees eindelijk alleen. De hemel verbleekt. Overvallen door de vloed. Op blinde rotsen neergesmeten. Breekt kristallen ademtocht. Houd je adem in, geen vuur. Als het licht je ogen dooft, zie niet om en richt de regenboog. De ark strandt in het kruiend slijf. Sta op en wandel, antediluviaan. Wandel tussen de koele sterren. Rijs op, mijn koningskind. Verrijs. Dank je.